So it turns out that the National Trust hates Winston Churchill. Well, not exactly hates. Actually, it's just that they produced a report which highlighted that Winston Churchill was engaged in some activities during the course of his life which some people today feel a little bit uncomfortable in. That's not to say that the National Trust hates Winston Churchill. It's simply acknowledging some factual realities. You might be aware of what's happening on with the National Trust because there's been lots of news coverage about it during the course of the week, and it's not the first time we've looked at the National Trust report into links between their properties and slavery and colonialism in the course of these videos. But it's flared up again this week as a raft of 2-bit MPs started throwing around some fairly hackneyed opinions about interpretation issues in relation to historic resources in the charge of the National Trust. So what's been going on? Just over a year ago now, I think, the National Trust commissioned a report which was looking into these historic links between their properties, slavery and colonialism. It's not a new thing that this report was commissioned. As I say, it's fairly well established, but it was relatively recently published. And a lot of people made a lot of noise about it. We saw a lot of keyboard warriors who were apparently National Trust members saying, "We gotta cancel our membership. We don't want to be members of the National Trust anymore because you're doing history. We don't want history in the National Trust. Oh, gotta cut up my membership cards." Alright, your choice. I suppose all you're doing is mildly making it more difficult to visit National Trust properties, but, you know, each to their own. We also saw some genuine members complain at the recent AGM, saying they were unhappy that the National Trust was interpreting their collections. It's a bit of a tough one, isn't it? There have been various accusations levied against the National Trust that they're going against their own charter. Now, if you look at the charter and the various forms of legislation that the National Trust actually operate by, there are a lot of rules and regulations put in place, a lot of pretty clear-cut guidelines saying this is what the National Trust can do, and this definitively is what the National Trust cannot do. There is nothing in there about interpretation. The language stresses that the National Trust has a responsibility to protect and promote the historic resources that they are responsible for. Now, I would suggest promotion relates to interpretation. How do you promote historic buildings unless you're willing to explore the context in which they are historically relevant and valid, and present that to your audiences? Interpretation seems an absolute given, but whatever your opinion about interpretation at the National Trust, there is nothing in its charter that says it should not be doing this. And yet, we recently had this series of reflections coming from a government minister. So this is Nigel Huddleston, the latest in a series of fairly anonymous Tory MPs to sit in the Culture Ministry post for a sort of a 6-month period before he disappears and we never hear of him again. But what I thought was really interesting, and I've actually read the entirety of this article, but as you can see, the main online version is stuck behind a paywall, and Rupert Murdoch ain't getting none of my money, so you'll just have to find a way to read this at your leisure. But ultimately what he's doing is critiquing, and let's be blunt about it, criticising the National Trust for interpreting their collections. What you can see of this highlights that Nigel Huddleston, Minister for Sport, Tourism and Heritage, has ruled out requests from an MP for an inquiry into the National Trust, which is a good thing, but then goes on to add that curating and preserving our great historic houses, gardens and landscapes for the nation is what the Trust should be concentrating on, and that there was something inherently wrong or problematic with the National Trust commissioning a survey which would strengthen their understanding as an organisation and audiences' understandings of the sites that the organisation is responsible for. Now, to me, the way I read this is you have a government minister which is putting pressure on the National Trust, a major national, not just an English, but an island-wide heritage provider, putting pressure on them to not interpret their collections. Now that seems to me a really dangerous pathway for us to be going down. We're talking about the willful ignorance of narratives that are applicable to our historic resources. And without wanting to be too over the top about this, this is only a few steps away from the sort of curation of historic narratives that would be more familiar to us in the context of fascism. That seems extreme, but if you've seen some of my other videos, fascism is what I teach, and this is awkwardly familiar to those sorts of repressive measures about the wrong sort of history. Because, of course, what Huddleston is actually saying isn't that the National Trust shouldn't be interpreting its collections. What Huddleston is saying is the National Trust should not be interpreting the bits of the collection which make some members of the National Trust and noisy people behind keyboards in darkened corners in the middle of the web feel a little bit uncomfortable, feel a little bit ashamed about the things that make them want to wear Union Jack hats on commemorative days during the course of the year. What he's saying is, don't talk shit about Churchill. Don't make people feel uncomfortable about British history. Don't make British history uncomfortable for the people. And really, you're seeing that all the way through. At the AGM, you're seeing comments from people saying, we don't want the memory of Churchill to be besmirched. But please do keep doing all that promotional stuff about all the nice and triumphal stuff that Churchill did. That sort of interpretation, well, that's just fine. So I think all of those people who are complaining about the negative side, if you want to frame it like that, really need to make a choice, because you can't just have some interpretation. You can't just have the interpretation that fits your agenda. You either have all the interpretation or no interpretation. And I'm ultimately happy to go down that path. If Huddleston and members of the National Trust who have been cutting up their membership cards want to go down a path where we don't acknowledge slavery links, and we don't acknowledge that some aspects of colonial history in a British context were a little bit uncomfortable, and we don't acknowledge that Winston Churchill, whilst being undeniably a leader of Britain in the context of victory in the Second World War, if there are really winners in that sort of context, okay, let's put all that to one side. But at the same time, you can't then push for an agenda of promoting all the bits of the narrative which are quite positive, such as Winston Churchill being a heroic war leader, because that sort of language is judgmental. And one thing the National Trust hasn't done is gone out and said Winston Churchill is bad because of this reason and that reason, or wealthy owners of specific buildings because of their links with the slave trade were bad people. The National Trust hasn't done this. What we've actually seen is lots of people who are supportive of figures who have these links to the slave trade saying, oh, it's terrible, they're drawing attention to the terrible things they did. Well, that's your language. It's not the language of the National Trust. So I think if you are going to shut down an interpretive door and block out the slave trade narrative and block out the awkward parts of colonial history, fine. You also have to knock out the triumphalism narrative that you might apply to Churchill and others, because, frankly, if you can't handle Churchill at his dirtiest, you don't deserve Churchill at his cleanest. So let's try to move forward on this and say, if you want interpretation, you've got to have the whole package. Let's not entertain a cultural context where members of the British government, where culture ministers who oversee the shaping of historic narratives and their delivery to wider local, national, international audiences, let's not go down a path where they are shutting down discourse and dialogue. Because if you're a fan of Churchill and you like the sort of anti-fascist rhetoric that you guys associate with him, the sort of thing that Huddleston is pushing is the exact sort of thing that you notionally say Churchill fought against. That's suppression, that's censorship, and it is a very, very dangerous path that we're going down. So, enjoy the weekend, guys.